hope you all are having a great week so far. We're going to go ahead and kick it off. We have another guest speaker today on our call, but before we start that conversation, just want to highlight some of the top things this week. We have the president's budget request was released last week, so we'll give some highlights about that. And then some two court rulings, federal appeals court rulings, signals good news for nonprofit funding, especially in the homelessness services space. So we'll lift that up. On the organizational side, remember that you can now register for this year's Bringing It Home, Ending Homelessness in North Carolina conference, which will take place on May 27th and 28th at the McKimmon Center in Raleigh. And so the link to do so is in the call notes. And then you can contact Stephanie Kirby with any questions, and her information is in the call notes as well. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker for today, Mr. Eric Stein, Senior Vice President with Self Help. Thank you so much, Eric, for joining us this morning. Wanted to invite you to today's call. This is sort of a part two to a conversation that we started last week, but specifically looking at what's on the table, looking at the current bill proposal that is being considered in the North Carolina House, specifically in the Committee for Property Tax Reduction Reform. Can you talk to us a little bit about the proposal that's being considered and the impacts that it would have on affordable housing? But before you dive into that, could you talk also a little bit about how we got here?
Absolutely. So 50 years ago, North Carolina passed a law that gave nonprofits doing affordable housing a property tax exemption. Around 10 years or so ago, a court considered the question of a low-income housing tax credit project where there's a nonprofit managing member who's running the project and passive for-profit entities taking the tax credits. And even though the nonprofit only owned 0.1%, the question was, is the nonprofit the true owner for tax purposes to get the tax exemption? And the court said yes in that fact situation. And so both of those things went along fine, except for around 2 years ago, some big law firms started writing memos telling private equity that they could mimic the structure of LIHTC, but for naturally occurring affordable housing, NOAH. I don't know if you all are familiar with that, but those are existing older apartment buildings where poor people naturally live and where the rents are naturally lower. And there's been an explosion just over the past 2 years of properties taken off the tax rolls for counties with these NOAH partnerships, which are 99.9% owned by for-profit, generally private equity purchasing them, and a 0.1 or even 0.01% ownership by a nonprofit that really doesn't have involvement in the project and doesn't really administer properties. Wake County has lost $2 billion of these properties from its tax rolls just over the last 2 years, losing $5 to $6 million that it really doesn't have, that it can't collect. And there are thousands of these NOAH properties all across the state, any one of which could be susceptible to these partnerships, which we consider to be shams. So that's the problem the legislature is trying to address.
Thank you so much. So with that context in mind, and for those listening, you use the word NOAH, which stands for Naturally Occurring Affordable Housing, like you talked about. Well, from your perspective, what is the proposed legislation actually proposing? What is it trying to do?
It's trying to close the loophole that has been created over the last couple of years and return the statute and the purpose of it to where it was before it started happening. And so it divides up affordable housing into two categories. The first categories are NOAH properties. This statute calls them non-government supported properties. And in that case, the only entity that can own it and get the tax exemption are nonprofits, 100% owned by nonprofits. They don't allow joint ventures with for-profits. And the reasoning is that out of all the thousands of potential NOAH partnership properties around the state, you can't really, as the state or the county, let private equity cherry pick which projects meet the terms of the statute because lower income people live there at lower rents and get the property tax exemption, where the private equity is doing exactly what they did before, which is putting a little bit of money in and raising the rents higher. There's still room to do that. That we only trust nonprofits only, whose mission is to constrain rents rather than provide returns to their investors. And so there's the NOAA properties, which only nonprofits can own. And then there's a second category of affordable housing, which are government-supported affordable housing. And that a nonprofit can own that, or a joint venture between a for-profit and a nonprofit. And the best example of government-supported is LIHTC, where you have a government agency picking a project out of the thousands of apartment projects around the state, picking a project and saying, there's a public benefit to supporting this with public dollars through the grant or the loan program involved in that program, as well as the property tax exemption. And the government agency picks the project. It requires affordability and enforces it and oversees it, compliance with the deed restriction or regulatory agreement. California has a similar structure where they only allow NOAA with 100% nonprofit, but then government supported. This is a category where some municipalities like San Francisco will see a project that they want to support that would have been a NOAA project, but they'll give it just a nominal amount of money, like $10,000, and also include a deed restriction for affordability, long-term affordability. And that's a way to turn a NOAA project that has local support into a government-supported project. And the purpose of that nominal grant is to provide the property tax exemption to the project. And so that would be permissible under the North Carolina, the draft statute that Stephanie mentioned. A couple other brief points about it. It leaves the existing statute for example, Habitat uses the existing statute for potentially for like offices or their restores. It leaves all that the same. It just talks about the rental housing in this new part of the statute. And then for LIHTC, it still allows the property tax exemption for LIHTC if the nonprofit is the managing member, if the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency approves that structure. What it doesn't allow is going backwards and changing the corporate structure of projects that were approved initially and started paying property taxes. It can't then change that structure in the future to then add a nonprofit managing member. So that's really what the proposed bill would do. It would try to close the loophole and keep it oriented towards affordable housing and stop the waste of tens of millions of dollars of property tax revenue that is being lost to really no public purpose, in my view.
Thank you. You mentioned what it doesn't do. Can you say? I know that we've been getting different type feedback on concerns. Is there anything you'd like to clarify or clear up about what this bill, proposed bill language does not do, as well as what kind of future considerations do you think need to be added to this overall dialogue?
Yeah, it doesn't take away the property tax exemption. It basically puts the property tax right back where it was before these partnerships on NOAA projects that are driven by private equity have a nominal often shell nonprofit participant that's simply there to get the tax exemption. And they get paid not by running the project, getting a proportion of the property tax savings. So that didn't happen before a couple years ago. So it really moves us back to what was going on before a couple years ago and tries to close the loophole. Because I think without closing that loophole, then they're just going to have to get rid of the affordable housing property tax exemption altogether, because there's just too much money being lost for too little gain. The prospects of the legislation, it's hard to pass legislation. You all have worked on it and realized that, and there's going to be a lot of money that private equity has invested in the state in these projects to try to defend it. And so it's not going to be an easy legislative battle for it to to pass. One last thing I will say is that it's not 100% clear that under existing law, these partnerships pass muster with that court decision. So that's something else to watch, whether if they continue to be granted or if the courts allow it. What the statute would do is make it really clear that you can't do those, which I think is probably necessary, and has a very clear process on where the exemption is provided.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eric, for your insight and expertise this morning. We are going to link the proposed bill language as well as a summary by staff on the proposed bill. But thank you again for spending some time with us on our housing call.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone, really quick in our last few minutes of the housing call today. As I mentioned on our top highlights last week, on Friday, April 3rd, the president released his fiscal year 2027 budget request. This year's request calls for about a 10% cut to non-defense programs. So from the housing, homelessness, and community development side, that looks like a $3.8 billion, with a B, a $3.8 billion cut to several programs. While this year's budget request, this fiscal year 2027 budget request, does not include the same level of severe cuts that we saw proposed in the fiscal year 26 budget request, it does zero out funding for essential programs like housing counseling, the Home Partnership Program, and Community Development Block Grants, or CDBG. The president's budget request also includes proposed changes to homelessness assistance grants programs and the implementation of various harmful requirements and time limits. And it also goes even further to propose prohibiting housing authorities from helping new families and giving out new vouchers, except vouchers for veterans and the Family Unification Program. If you all remember last year, I know it feels like an era ago, but last year, thanks to a lot of strong collective advocacy efforts across sectors, Congress rejected the president's proposed cuts and instead provided significant funding increases for HUD and managed to hold the line and protect a lot of those critical programs. So we will continue to monitor these budget conversations and keep you informed about these upcoming advocacy opportunities throughout the budget season. The second highlight that I want to lift up is that, again, last week, the U.S. federal court ruled that HUD's newly imposed politicized criteria for the Continuum of Care, COC Builds grants, are unconstitutional and unlawful. And the court also ordered that the $75 million that's already appropriated for the grants must remain available. So that's court decision number one. Another court decision from the First Circuit Court of Appeals also temporarily blocked the Trump administration's request to implement unlawful and unreasonable restrictions that seek to shift funding away from proven solutions to homelessness. This order comes out of a suit brought by the National Alliance to End Homelessness against HUD, and they were joined by several local governments as well as nonprofit organizations across the country that are seeking to prevent the administration's attempt to stop funding for permanent housing projects and other critical homelessness services. With that, as you all know, we try and make sure that we don't take up too much of your time in the mornings. On the state update side, we do have upcoming legislative committee meetings next week. The House Select Committee on Property Tax Reduction and Reform will convene next Wednesday. This will be an important one to tune into or attend if you are able to. We have local highlights and different reports and events listed in the call notes for you to look through. As always, thank you so much for tuning in. And if you want us to cover anything else or you have additional questions, either from our guest speakers last week and this week, please don't hesitate to reach out. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and we will talk to you next time.